The Consciousness Code podcast episode 8 Flow Presence and the states we chase when feeling more alive is not always the same as being more conscious. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code podcast. In the last episode, we explored dissociation, numbness and quiet absence, what happens when the system protects itself not through intensity, but through distance. We looked at emotional flatness, reduced access, inward withdrawal, and the painful reality that a person can remain outwardly functional while becoming harder and harder to reach from within. In this episode, we move into what might seem like the opposite territory, because not all difficult states are quiet. Some are vivid, immersive, compelling, charged, magnetic, beautiful even. Some states make us feel more alive, more focused, more here, more energized, more gathered, more meaningful, more connected to ourselves, or at least more powerfully removed from the dullness, fragmentation, boredom, or absence that so often marks ordinary life. That is where this episode begins, with a question that matters more than it might seem at first. When I feel most alive, am I actually most present, or am I simply in a state that overpowers quieter forms of absence? That distinction matters enormously, because many of us spend years chasing states without fully understanding what those states are doing for us. We chase romance, creative highs, pressure, adrenaline, recognition, work intensity, spiritual experiences, peak performance, chemistry, longing, beauty, conflict sometimes, movement, novelty. Underneath many of those pursuits is a simple human hunger, the hunger to feel more here, more real, more touched, more engaged, more alive than we feel in flatter, quieter, more ordinary modes of consciousness. That hunger makes sense, especially if you've known numbness, especially if you've known dissociation, especially if ordinary life has started feeling procedural, muted, role-bound, or thin. Of course, a person will seek what makes them feel more vivid. Of course, they will move toward what sharpens the edges again, what gathers attention, what floods color back into the world, what temporarily restores depth, urgency, beauty, meaning, or momentum. The problem is not that we long to feel alive. The problem is that we often confuse aliveness with presence, and those are not always the same thing. A state can be intense without being integrated. A state can be vivid without being grounded. A state can feel deep without actually widening consciousness. A state can feel transcendent while still functioning partly as escape. That is what this episode is going to explore, what flow actually is, how presence differs from stimulation, why do some states nourish and widen us, while others only temporarily rescue us from absence, why certain experiences become addictive, not always chemically, but psychologically, existentially, spiritually, why do some people only feel like themselves when they are in motion, in longing, in love, in pressure, in beauty, in work, in risk, in performance, in becoming? And perhaps most importantly, we'll ask what genuine presence actually feels like when it is no longer confused with drama, urgency, or intensity. Because one of the most subtle traps in modern consciousness is this. We may believe we are seeking truth, meaning, or depth, when in reality, we are often seeking relief from flatness. And again, that is not a moral failure. It is deeply human. But if we do not understand it, we can build our lives around chasing states that feel alive without ever really asking whether they are bringing us into deeper contact, or simply making us feel less absent for a while. That is a profound difference, because one kind of aliveness leaves you more whole afterwards. The other leaves you hungry again. One kind deepens your relationship to reality. The other gives you an experience strong enough to distract you from what reality feels like without it. One kind is presence. The other is state dependence. The trouble is, from the inside, those two can feel astonishingly similar at first. So this episode is not against intensity. It is not against beauty. It is not against romance, creativity, ecstasy, flow, high engagement, immersion, or meaningful states of absorption. Some of these are among the most important experiences we can have. But if we do not distinguish between what opens us and what overrides us, we will keep mistaking vividness for consciousness. That confusion can shape an entire life. So that is where we are going today, into liveliness, into immersion, into flow, into stimulation, into the psychology of what we chase when ordinary consciousness starts feeling too dull, too fragmented, too burdened, or too far away from what we think being alive should feel like. Perhaps if we do this well, into a more honest understanding of what presence is. Not every state that makes us feel more is actually bringing us deeper into ourselves. Some states only make us feel less absent. That is where we begin. Not every alive state is presence. One of the most important distinctions we can make in conscious life is this. Not every living state is presence. That may sound simple, but it cuts through a lot of confusion. Because when a state feels vivid, intense, immersive, energizing, or beautiful, we tend to assume it must be good, or at least truer than ordinary life. We assume that if something makes us feel more awake, more emotionally engaged, more focused, more charged, more absorbed, more magnetized toward life, then it must be bringing us closer to consciousness itself. But that is not always what is happening. Sometimes what feels like aliveness is genuine contact. Sometimes what feels like aliveness is simply a stronger state overpowering a quieter absence underneath. This matters because many people do not realize how much of their life is organized around escaping flatness. Not always through obvious addictions. Sometimes through work. Sometimes through romance. Sometimes through conflict. Sometimes through performance. Sometimes through intense spiritual seeking. sometimes through stimulation so constant that stillness starts feeling almost unbearable. In each case, what the person often says is, "This is when I feel most alive." Now that may be true in one sense, but the deeper question is, what kind of liveliness is this? Is it widening me, or just overpowering what I feel without it? Let's take work as an example. Some people feel most alive when they are fully locked into a task. The mind is sharp, the body is moving, the attention is gathered, time is altered, and the world narrows into something purposeful and coherent. They are not bored, not drifting, not emotionally diffuse. They feel switched on. That can be a healthy, deeply meaningful flow. But it can also become a state a person depends on because ordinary consciousness feels too fragmented by comparison. The pressure, the deadlines, the challenge, the acceleration, all of it creates enough intensity to organize the self temporarily. The person feels alive not simply because they are meaningfully engaged, but because the state is rescuing them from an underlying flatness they do not know how to meet in quieter ways. The same can happen in romance. A person meets someone, and suddenly the world has color again. Attention sharpens, tiny details become meaningful, time changes, long appears, possibility expands, the body wakes up, thought becomes more vivid, life feels charged. This can be beautiful, real, opening, transformative, even. But it can also become confusing. Because if a person has been living in low contact, role-bound, muted states for a long time, romantic intensity may feel like awakening itself. Not just attraction, but salvation. Not just chemistry, but truth. Not just longing, but depth. This is where people can begin mistaking obsession, idealization, or emotionally amplified attachment for genuine presence. The state feels alive, yes, but that does not automatically mean it is clear. It may be widening consciousness in some respects while distorting it in others. It may feel sacred because it brings color back into a gray interior world. But what it is doing may be less about revealing the deepest truth of love and more about temporarily rescuing the self from absence. That is not to reduce the beauty of the attraction. It is to understand the function of the state. The same pattern can happen with adrenaline. Some people feel most alive under pressure, in risk, in urgency, in the final hour before a deadline, in conflict, in movement, on the edge of almost too much. Again, there is a reason for this. Adrenaline gathers the field. It narrows attention. It intensifies the moment. It can reduce diffuse uncertainty by creating one clear direction. In a fragmented life, that can feel cleansing. In a dull life, it can feel like proof of being alive. But adrenaline is not the same as presence. Adrenaline can produce vividness without depth, sharpness without spaciousness, intensity without integration. It can make you feel more here while actually narrowing consciousness in ways that leave little room for reflection, softness, complexity, or real contact. The same is true of social highs. Some people feel most alive when they are being seen, performing well, speaking beautifully, making others laugh, holding a room, and becoming the magnetic version of themselves. In those moments, they feel bright, connected, vivid, fluid. And again, some of this may be real, relational aliveness, but some of it may also be state-based identity. The person may not only enjoy being alive in those moments, they may need those moments to feel real at all. The performance becomes the access point to selfhood. Ordinary life feels flat, being seen feels alive. The gap between the two becomes enormous. And now the state is no longer simply enjoyable, it is compensatory. This can happen spiritually too. A person may feel most alive in prayer, meditation, retreats, ceremonies, altered states, moments of beauty, transcendence, surrender, or energetic intensity. These experiences can be deeply meaningful. They can genuinely widen consciousness, soften defensive structure, deepen contact, and reveal something important. But even here, a caution is needed, because a person can begin chasing spiritual intensity for the same reason another person chases romance or performance, because the state feels more alive than ordinary life. And when that happens, the spiritual high may function less as true deepening and more as intermittent escape from dullness, fragmentation, boredom, or existential distance. So again, the question is not, is this state beautiful? It may well be. The question is, what is this state doing in me? Is it helping me inhabit reality more fully afterwards? Or does it leave me craving the next hit of aliveness, because ordinary life still feels too thin without it? That distinction is central to this episode, because not every state that feels alive is actually teaching us how to be present. Some states are dazzling, compelling, absorbing, electrifying, meaning-rich, powerful. Still, they may be acting primarily as a relief from absence. That does not make them worthless. But it does mean we need discernment. Because if we confuse intensity with consciousness, we will keep building our lives around what feels vivid rather than around what is actually sustaining. We will chase what gathers us for a moment, rather than learning how to remain in contact without needing to be overtaken. And this is one of the most subtle challenges in human life. Many people do not know how to feel truly alive in ordinary presence. They know how to feel alive in longing, in pressure, in immersion, in ecstasy, in stimulation, in peak experience. But if you remove the heightened state, something quieter emerges. Boredom, restlessness, flatness, unease, emptiness, distance. That quieter layer is what often gets overpowered by the alive state, which means the state feels precious not only because it is beautiful, but because it drowns something else out. This is the real hook of the episode. Not every living state is presence. Some states make us feel more alive because they widen us. Others make us feel more alive because they are strong enough to silence the absence underneath. Unless we understand that difference, we will keep confusing what is vivid with what is true. That is the line we will keep following from here. What flow actually is, how it differs from stimulation. Why do some states nourish and others merely organize? Why do we chase what we chase? What genuine presence feels like when it is no longer confused with intensity. Because if we really want a more conscious life, then we have to become honest about the kinds of aliveness we trust too quickly. Some are openings, some are escapes that glow. And telling the difference may be one of the most important forms of discernment we can develop. What is flow? If we are going to talk seriously about the states we chase, then we need to slow down and ask a more careful question. What is flow, actually? Because flow is one of those words people use very loosely. Sometimes they use it to mean motivation. Sometimes they use it to mean excitement. Sometimes they use it to mean being busy, productive, inspired, energized, obsessive, passionate, or in the zone. And some of those states do overlap with the flow, but they are not all the same thing. Flow is not just stimulation. It is not just being hyped up. It is not just being emotionally intense. It is not just about being productive. It is not just getting lost in something compulsively. It is not just adrenaline. It is not just an obsession. Flow is something more specific. It is a state of organized immersion, a state in which attention, action, and awareness begin to move together with unusual coherence. The mind is not scattered. The body is not fighting itself in the same way. The task is demanding enough to gather you, but not so overwhelming that it crushes you. Time may change. Self-consciousness may soften. You are not thinking about yourself in the same fragmented way. You are in the doing. That is why flow can feel so compelling. For a while, the ordinary frictions of selfhood quieten. The second guessing, the self-monitoring, the split between what you are doing and how you feel about doing it, the sense of drag, the noise of identity, all of that can be reduced. In its place comes a more unified experience. Action and awareness feel joined. That joining is one of the reasons flow often feels more alive than ordinary consciousness. Because ordinary consciousness for many people is not especially unified. It is fragmented, interrupted, self-aware in a strained way, full of competing pulls, layered with distraction, tension, and internal commentary. So when flow arrives, it can feel like relief, not only because the activity is enjoyable, but because the person becomes more internally coherent while doing it. That matters, because one of the most beautiful things about flow is that it often gives us a temporary glimpse of what consciousness feels like when it is less divided against itself. The painter disappears into the painting. The musician disappears into the playing. The athlete disappears into movement. The writer disappears into language. The craftsperson disappears into the work of the hands. The thinker disappears into the problem. The dancer disappears into rhythm. What remains is not emptiness, it is contact. This is why real flow can be deeply nourishing. Not because it is dramatic, not because it is chemically thrilling, but because it gathers the self, for a while at least. And yet this is where we need nuance, because not every gathered state is a flow in the richer sense. Some states only mimic it. A person may work for 10 hours with manic intensity, unable to stop, unable to rest, unable to break contact with the task, and call that flow. But it may not be flow. It may be compulsion. It may be pressure-driven overfocus. It may be anxiety harnessed into productivity. It may be an escape through work. It may feel immersive, yes. But the question is whether it is coherent, life-giving, and integrated, or whether it is simply powerful enough to drown out the rest of the self for a while. That distinction is crucial, because flow has a different emotional signature than compulsion. Compulsion is often tighter, more defended, more brittle, less spacious, less forgiving, less alive in the deeper sense, even when highly effective. Flow can be intense, but it usually has more ease in it. Not ease in the sense of being effortless, but ease in the sense that the person is not fighting the activity in the same way. There is a challenge, yes. Precision, yes. Depth, yes. But there is also a kind of fit between person and task. A sense that the system is being stretched into alive coordination, rather than driven through internal coercion. That fit matters a great deal, because flow is not just about what you are doing. It is about the relationship between your capacity and the demand. Too little challenge, and consciousness drifts. Too much challenge, and the system moves toward anxiety, overwhelm, or collapse. But in a certain middle band, the activity becomes just demanding enough to gather your resources without breaking your coherence. That is why flow often appears where skill and challenge meet. Not where life is easy, not where life is crushing, but where something in you is being called forward at exactly the level that requires you to become fully involved. This is one reason flow can feel meaningful in a way that mere stimulation does not. Stimulation can flood you. Flow invites you. Stimulation can overpower you. Flow recruits you. Stimulation may heighten the system through force, novelty, or intensity. Flow tends to organize the system through participation. This is why the body matters here too. Real flow is not only a mental state, it is embodied. The body starts timing itself differently. Effort becomes more efficient. Attention becomes less jerky. Movement and perception begin coordinating more smoothly. Even in still tasks, writing, coding, designing, composing, praying, and reflecting, the body is participating in the coherence of the state. Breathing may settle into a more functional rhythm. Fine motor control becomes more available. Tension may reduce in some places while energy rises in others. The person feels both active and joined. That joining is one of the reasons flow has often been described as a kind of effortless effort. You are clearly doing something. Sometimes something is difficult, something demanding, something requiring high precision, yet the doing is no longer divided against itself in the same way. There is effort, but less drag. That matters in conscious life because drag is exhausting. The drag of self-consciousness, the drag of internal conflict, the drag of constant second-guessing, the drag of boredom, the drag of wanting to be elsewhere, the drag of trying to force yourself through something that does not fit. Flow reduces that drag. That is why it can feel restorative even when it is demanding. Perhaps that is one of the deepest reasons human beings treasure it, not because it makes us superhuman, but because it briefly lets us feel what it is like to be less split. Now, all of that said, there is another side to this, because the states that resemble flow can become seductive very quickly, especially for people who are used to inner fragmentation numbness or low-contact living. A person who feels dull in ordinary life may experience flow as revelation. A person whose consciousness is usually scattered may experience deep absorption as the only time they really feel like themselves. A person who has lived in quiet absence may find that highly immersive states feel almost sacred because they restore color structure and immediacy to a life that often feels thin. This is where the beauty of flow can become psychologically complicated, because the person may begin loving the state not only for what it is, but for what it saves them from. It saves them from self-fragmentation, from boredom, from role consciousness, from emotional deadness, from the ache of not feeling fully here. So flow becomes not only meaningful engagement, but refuge. Once it becomes a refuge, it can start being chased for reasons that go beyond the activity itself. The writer may not only love writing, they may love how writing rescues them from ordinary selfhood. The athlete may not only love movement, they may love what movement does to silence the restlessness underneath. The musician may not only love music, they may love how music briefly makes them feel whole. The high performer may not only love achievement, they may love how pressure produces a state in which everything else falls away. None of this invalidates the state. It deepens our understanding of why it matters so much. This is where we have to distinguish between healthy flow and state dependence. Healthy flow leaves something behind. It may tire you, yes. It may demand a lot. But afterwards, there is often a sense of meaningful expenditure, a felt participation, a coherence that extends a little beyond the activity itself. State dependence, by contrast, often leaves a crash, not always physically, but existentially. Once the state ends, the person falls back into flatness, fragmentation, or discomfort and begins needing the state again, not only because it is beautiful, but because ordinary life feels intolerable by comparison. That is an entirely different relationship. One is nourishment, the other is rescue. This is why asking what flow actually is becomes so important, because if we do not define it carefully, we will keep calling all forms of high engagement flow, and in doing so, we will miss the very thing that makes genuine flow valuable. Genuine flow is not merely powerful, it is integrative. It not only feels strong, it feels joined. It not only creates intensity, it creates coherence. It not only removes boredom, it deepens participation. This is why flow is so closely tied to presence, though not identical to it. Presence is wider than flow. A person can be deeply present while doing very little, sitting quietly, listening, walking, cooking, holding someone, looking out of a window, breathing, noticing. Presence does not require challenge in the same way flow often does. It does not depend on absorption into a demanding task. Presence is more fundamental. It is direct contact with reality as it is unfolding. Flow is one specific mode of presence, organized, absorbed, task-related presence. That is why the two need to be separated carefully, because a person can be present without being in flow. A person can appear highly absorbed without being truly present in the deeper sense. That second possibility matters a great deal. Someone can be consumed by work, music, exercise, sex, risk, or thought in a way that looks like flow, but is actually slightly dissociative, slightly compulsive, slightly defensive, slightly overdriven. The activity has them, but not in a free way. They are not simply gathered. They are also escaping, not necessarily consciously, but functionally. So the question is not only, am I absorbed? It is, what kind of absorption is this? Does it make me more alive afterwards? More grounded? More available? More integrated? More in contact with myself and the world? Or does it simply give me a temporary break from the parts of ordinary consciousness I do not know how to inhabit? That is the question beneath the whole episode, and it begins here in how we understand flow itself. Because flow at its best is not just a high, it is a form of gathered consciousness. A state in which challenge and capacity meet in such a way that the self stops fighting its own participation. A state in which action and awareness align enough that something in us becomes less divided. A state that can feel deeply alive because it is not merely stimulating the system, but organizing it. That is why it feels so different from ordinary distraction. That is why it can feel almost sacred. But that is also why it is so easy to confuse it with other heightened states that only imitate coherence. So we have to stay careful, not cynical, not dismissive, not suspicious of beauty, just careful enough to ask, is this state making me more present, or simply more occupied, more coherent, or just more overwhelmed by one thing than by the many quieter absences beneath it? Because once we start asking that, we begin to develop the discernment this episode really needs. The discernment to know that some states gather us because they fit us. Others gather us because they are forceful enough to silence our fragmentation for a while. Both can feel powerful. Only one is true flow in the deeper sense, and that is the bridge into the next question. If flow is organized immersion, then how do we distinguish it from the many forms of stimulation that modern life keeps selling us as liveliness? Presence versus stimulation. One of the great confusions of modern life is that stimulation is constantly mistaken for liveliness, not only in advertising, not only in entertainment, not only in social media, in ourselves. We feel more activated and assume we are more present. We feel more engaged and assume we are more conscious. We feel more charged, more drawn, more alert, more compelled, and we take that inner intensity as proof that something important, meaningful, or deeply true is happening. But stimulation and presence are not the same thing. They can overlap. They can resemble each other. They can even travel together for a while, but they are not identical. Presence has contact in it. Stimulation has force in it. Presence may be vivid, but it is not necessarily urgent. Stimulation is often urgent, even when it feels pleasurable. Presence can be quiet. Stimulation usually depends on amplification. Presence widens. Stimulation often sharpens and narrows at the same time. That distinction matters because many people no longer trust a state unless it feels strong enough to cut through the noise. The noise for most people is real. The noise of distraction, the noise of self-consciousness, the noise of low-grade anxiety, the noise of boredom, the noise of role performance, the noise of emotional flatness, the noise of a life that is constantly asking for a response without always offering real depth in return. So when something comes along that jolts the system into vividness, of course, it feels meaningful. A new attraction, a new goal, a new idea, a new crisis, a new conflict, a new desire, a new obsession, a new environment, a new pressure, a new performance high, a new stream of novelty. All of these can make a person feel more awake. But being more awake in one sense is not always the same as being more present in the deeper sense. This is especially clear when we look at how stimulation functions in ordinary life. Take constant background noise. Many people now live with a near continuous layer of input: music, podcasts, videos, notifications, scrolling, messaging, content, commentary, and ambient digital company. The mind is rarely left alone with itself long enough to settle into direct contact. After a while, stillness can begin to feel not peaceful, but uncomfortable. Why? Because without stimulation, quieter layers start becoming audible. Boredom, restlessness, loneliness, low-grade emptiness, unprocessed feeling, diffuse discomfort, the simple unfamiliarity of being with oneself without being occupied. So a person reaches again for stimulation, not always because they consciously want entertainment, but because stimulation gives shape to consciousness. It creates motion, it fills the room. It rescues the self from having to sit in an unamplified field. That is not the same as presence. It is often the opposite. It is a way of avoiding the ordinary depth of being here by layering enough input over it that the self feels active again. And this is why boredom matters so much in a conversation like this, because boredom is not always the absence of interesting things. Sometimes boredom is what appears when a nervous system that has become dependent on stimulation is asked to remain with ordinary life without being constantly fed. In that sense, boredom can function almost like a withdrawal state. The person is not really bored because reality is empty. They are bored because reality, without stimulation, no longer feels vivid enough to hold them. That is a very different problem, and it tells us something important. Some people do not know how to feel alive unless something external is strong enough to organize them. This can happen with speed, with noise, with novelty, with social performance, with pressure, with ambition, with sexual tension, with attraction, with danger, with being watched, with being admired, with being wanted, with being needed. All of these can generate intensity, and intensity has a certain advantage over presence. It is easier to notice. Presence is subtle by comparison. It does not always come with drama. It does not always come with a surge. It does not always feel chemically exciting. It does not always flatter the ego. It does not always produce a story. Sometimes presence feels almost plain, but plain in a very alive way, a direct way, a settled way, a way that does not need amplification to feel real. That is one reason people can miss it. They are waiting to feel awakened by something, and presence often arrives not as awakening by force, but as contact without distortion. That may happen in a conversation where you are truly listening, in a walk where the body is actually there, in a moment of grief that is fully met, in cooking without hurry, in writing without performance, in prayer without seeking spectacle, in silence that is not empty but inhabited, in affection that does not need intensity to prove itself. These are not always glamorous states, but they are deeply conscious ones. This is where stimulation can become deceptive, because stimulation often feels more alive than ordinary presence precisely because it is louder. A person in an argument may feel intensely present because everything in them is firing, but that may not be presence, it may be activation. A person in romantic obsession may feel more awake than ever before, but that may not be presence. It may be longing amplified by uncertainty, fantasy, projection, and emotional charge. A person in an ambitious performance state may feel more coherent than in ordinary life, but that may not be presence. It may be pressure organizing the field through urgency. This is why we need a more disciplined distinction. Presence does not require overwhelm. Stimulation often does. Presence can remain with what is here. Stimulation often needs more novelty, more movement, more charge, more urgency, more music, more text, more people, more feedback, more intensity, more momentum, and if a person only feels truly alive under those conditions, then something important has happened. Ordinary consciousness has become too underpowered to feel meaningful. That is not a trivial thing, because it means that the person may not be seeking truth or depth as such. They may be seeking enough stimulation to override the flatness they experience without it. That is one reason modern culture is so dangerous in this area. It gives endless access to stimulation while steadily weakening many people's capacity for direct presence. If every quiet moment is interrupted, every feeling is immediately managed by input, every lull is filled, every boredom spike medicated with novelty, then the subtler forms of aliveness begin to feel insufficient. A person then starts assuming that real life must feel dramatic to count. But real life is often quieter than that. And this is where genuine presence can feel almost disappointing at first to someone who is used to stimulation, because presence may not flood them, it may not spike them, it may not thrill them, it may simply bring them back to breath, back to body, back to the room, back to the person in front of them, back to the grief they have been circling, back to the joy they had gone numb to, back to reality without theatrical enhancement. That return can feel subtle, sometimes even too subtle, especially for people who have built an identity around intensity, the one who needs urgency to perform, the one who needs longing to feel love, the one who needs stimulation to feel creative, the one who needs conflict to feel contact, the one who needs admiration to feel real, the one who needs movement to avoid collapse into stillness. For such a person, presence can initially feel almost like not enough, and that is where discernment becomes essential, because if stimulation is all you trust, then the quieter truth will keep getting overlooked. The calm conversation will feel less real than the dramatic one. The steady love will feel less alive than the uncertain longing. The peaceful day will feel less meaningful than the chaotic high. The ordinary body will feel less interesting than the adrenalized one. The slow, real self will feel less compelling than the heightened self. But compelling is not the same as conscious. That may be the core sentence of this part. What compels you is not always what deepens you. What stimulates you is not always what nourishes you. What activates you is not always what widens you. What makes you feel less empty is not always what heals the emptiness. Sometimes stimulation is simply a stronger state overwhelming a weaker one, and because the stronger state feels more vivid, the person calls it life. But life is not only what is loud enough to be felt through numbness. Life is also what remains when the need for loudness subsides. That is why presence, in the deeper sense, is often less addictive than stimulation. Stimulation leaves you hungry. Presence often leaves you fuller. Stimulation says more. Presence says here. Stimulation pulls you outward toward the next hit of vividness. Presence brings you inward and outward at once, into yourself and into reality without splitting the two. This is not a rejection of stimulation altogether. Human beings need variety, beauty, challenge, play, excitement, art, movement, romance, adventure. None of these is the enemy. The problem comes when stimulation becomes the only doorway through which a person can still feel alive, because then life itself starts being organized around escape from ordinariness, and ordinariness is where a great deal of real presence actually lives. Not glamorous ordinariness, not deadening routine, but simple contact. The feeling of a body that is really here, the taste of food when you are actually eating, the sound of another person's voice when you are truly listening, the experience of walking without needing to be elsewhere, the quiet of a room that does not need to be filled, the ability to rest without disappearing. These are not minor things. They are among the clearest signs that presence is returning. And perhaps that is the deepest challenge of this section, to learn how to value the kind of aliveness that does not always dazzle, the kind that does not need to win your attention through force, the kind that does not depend on emotional charge, the kind that is not built on escape from flatness through intensity, the kind that may feel less exciting at first, but more inhabitable in the long run. Because if we do not learn that distinction, we will keep handing authority to what is stimulating rather than what is true. And that is how whole lives become organized around what feels vivid instead of what is actually real enough to live in. So presence versus stimulation is not a minor distinction. It is one of the central discernments of consciousness. Because once you know the difference, you stop asking only what makes me feel alive and start asking what kind of aliveness is this? Does it widen me or narrow me? Does it gather me or overpower me? Does it leave me more whole or simply less absent for a while? Those questions are where deeper honesty begins. And once they begin, the next question naturally follows. If stimulation is not the same as presence, then what are the states we keep chasing? And what are they really doing for us? The states we chase, if not every alive state, is presence. And if stimulation can imitate aliveness without necessarily deepening consciousness, then the next question becomes deeply personal. What are the states we keep chasing, and why do they hold so much power over us? Because most people do not fall into certain states by accident. They begin returning to them, repeating them, organizing around them, building rituals, habits, fantasies, schedules, identities, even whole lives around the states that make them feel more vivid, more gathered, more coherent, more real. And very often, what they are chasing is not just pleasure in the simple sense. It is a relief. Relief from flatness, from fragmentation, from self-consciousness, from boredom, from emotional deadness, from inner conflict, from the dull ache of ordinary consciousness when ordinary consciousness no longer feels inhabitable enough on its own. This is where the subject becomes more honest. Because if a person says, I love this, that may be true, but it may not be the whole truth. The deeper truth may be, I love who I become in this state, or even, I love what this state saves me from. That is a very different sentence. It shifts the focus away from the object being chased and back toward the structure of consciousness itself. Why does this particular state feel so necessary? What disappears when I enter it? What returns? What gets silenced? What gets amplified? What part of me is relieved when this state arrives? Take work, for example. Some people do not just enjoy work. They disappear into it. They feel most coherent under pressure, most organized under deadline, most vivid when there are problems to solve, demands to meet, systems to manage, outputs to produce. In those states, scattered thought becomes directed thought. Emotional ambiguity is pushed aside. The self feels more unified. There is less room for drift, less room for sadness, less room for unresolved relationships with the body, with grief, with intimacy, with vulnerability. Work becomes more than employment or craft. It becomes a state generator. It becomes one of the ways the person escapes the unbearable looseness of less structured consciousness. Now, again, this does not make work meaningless. The person may genuinely be talented, devoted, engaged, or purposeful. But alongside all that, work may also be functioning as a rescue. The state of intense directedness may not only be satisfying, but necessary, because without it something heavier and flatter begins to re-emerge. The same is true of romantic states. Some people are not only seeking love, they are seeking the state that romantic longing creates in them. The sense of anticipation, charge, projection, attention, vividness, emotional magnetism, future possibility, and symbolic meaning. Romance can make the world feel textured again. It sharpens details. It gives small signals enormous weight. It creates narrative. It can restore color to an otherwise gray emotional field. This is why some people repeatedly chase the beginning more than the bond, the longing more than the relationship, the uncertainty more than the actual intimacy. It is not always because they are shallow or avoidant in any simple sense. Sometimes it is because longing produces a state that feels more alive than settled love. Settled love may be deeper, truer, kinder, more sustaining, but it may not flood the nervous system in the same way. For a person who has grown used to needing emotional intensity to feel real, devotion may feel flatter than desire, stability less compelling than pursuit, tenderness less gripping than obsession. So they chase the state and call it love, when part of what they are really chasing is heightened aliveness. Adrenaline works similarly. Some people come most fully online at the edge, in urgency, in risk, in competition, in performance, in danger, in time pressure. In situations where the body must mobilize sharply, the world narrows into a single line of action. There is something clean about such states. The noise falls away. The body knows what it is doing. The mind stops wandering. There is less internal debate. Action becomes immediate, vivid, coherent. And that can be intoxicating, especially for someone whose ordinary life feels heavy, ambiguous, or emotionally diluted. The problem is that adrenaline can become an anti-numbness strategy. It does not always widen consciousness. Often it narrows it. But, because the narrowing is vivid, it feels like life. This is one reason some people need crises, provoke crises, drift toward volatile environments, or repeatedly perform best only when things are almost too much. They are not only responding to external conditions, they may be relying on those conditions to generate a state in which they can finally feel fully switched on. Spiritual states can be chased in much the same way. A person may move through contemplative practice, ceremony, retreat, breathwork, prayer, meditation, psychedelics, ecstatic music, altered states, or mystical frameworks not only because they are seeking truth, but because those states temporarily reorganize consciousness in a way that feels clean, deep, meaningful, and whole. Again, some of these experiences are genuinely profound and life-giving. They may reduce defensiveness, deepen presence, soften self-structure, and allow contact with reality in beautiful ways. But spiritual intensity can also become compensatory. A person may begin chasing transcendence because ordinary consciousness feels too flat. They may chase unity because ordinary selfhood feels fractured. They may chase devotion because simple embodied life feels emotionally inaccessible. They may keep seeking peak states because coming back down returns them to the unresolved structures they were hoping the state itself would dissolve. When that happens, spirituality becomes less a path of deepening and more a cycle of intermittent rescue. Creative states can function this way too. The artist, writer, musician, designer, builder, or thinker may discover that deep immersion in creation feels more real than ordinary life. And often this is not fantasy. Creative absorption can be one of the most authentic forms of human coherence. It can gather body attention, feeling, memory, and meaning into something deeply lived. But even here there is nuance. A person may not only love creating, they may also depend on creation to escape a baseline condition of fragmentation or emotional distance. The creative state becomes the only time the self feels joined. Outside it, ordinary tasks feel dead, conversations shallow, practical life intolerably thin. So the person begins structuring everything around access to the state, not just because the work matters, but because without it, they do not know how to remain with themselves. Even conflict can become a chase state. That sounds strange until you look closely at how many people feel more vividly alive in tension than in calm. In conflict, everything sharpens. The self becomes clear, the other becomes defined. Emotion surges, language matters. The body wakes up. Suppressed feeling becomes speakable. Even if the experience is painful, it can still feel more real than quiet relational distance. Some people unconsciously return to conflict, not because they enjoy suffering, but because conflict produces contact where ordinary life has become numb. A row, a rupture, a charged exchange can temporarily cut through flatness and make the relationship feel immediate again. This is one of the reasons unstable relational systems can become addictive. They are painful, but they are vivid, and vividness is often mistaken for depth. Status and recognition can function in the same way. Being admired, desired, validated, watched, appreciated, applauded, selected, or affirmed can create a powerful state of coherence. The self brightens, shame recedes. Identity stabilizes. The person feels more substantial, more visible, more real. Social reward can do what solitude cannot. It can generate a state in which the self feels charged and organized. That is why some people begin to live around praise. Not because they are vain in some cartoonish way, but because being seen relieves something unbearable in not being seen. Recognition becomes regulation. Visibility becomes aliveness. And once that happens, the person not only enjoys appreciation, but they also need the state it creates. This is where the conversation deepens. The states we chase are often not random preferences. They are strategies of self-organization. There are ways of becoming temporarily more available to ourselves through conditions strong enough to overrule the quieter background states we do not know how to inhabit. Work may rescue us from drift. Romance may rescue us from deadness. Adrenaline may rescue us from boredom. Spiritual intensity may rescue us from fragmentation. Conflict may rescue us from emotional flatness. Praise may rescue us from shame. Creative immersion may rescue us from ordinary self-consciousness. The state becomes precious not only because it is enjoyable, but because it counteracts a less tolerable baseline. That baseline matters. Because what a person chases tells you something about what ordinary life feels like to them without it. If someone can rest in plain presence, then intense states may enrich their life without ruling it. But if someone cannot tolerate ordinary consciousness, if stillness feels empty, if calm feels dead, if routine feels unreal, if quiet feels intolerable, if nothing feels meaningful without heightened charge, then the state being chased is doing much more than adding beauty or excitement. It is compensating for an inner absence. That is why the language of chasing matters more than the language of liking. Liking a state is one thing. Chasing it means that the state has begun to organize desire, expectation, and selfhood around itself. It becomes a hidden authority. The person starts measuring life against it. Ordinary life becomes not simply ordinary, but insufficient. People start saying things like, I only feel like myself when, and whatever follows that sentence deserves very close attention. I only feel like myself when I'm writing, when I'm performing, when I'm in love, when things are intense, when I'm working flat out, when I'm in nature, when I'm under pressure, when I'm needed, when I'm creating, when I'm winning. Sometimes that sentence points toward a true line of vocation or nourishment. Sometimes it points toward dependency on a state that has become the main route out of estrangement. This does not mean the answer is to renounce the state. That would be too simple and often untrue. The answer is to become more honest about its function. What does this state give me? What does it take away? What does it relieve? Does it leave me more whole, more grounded, more in contact after it passes? Or does it leave me craving the next return because the underlying emptiness, boredom, fragmentation, or flatness remains untouched? That question separates nourishment from sedation by intensity, because some states genuinely enlarge life. They wake up capacities that then remain more available afterwards. They leave a trace of integration, more patience, more openness, more courage, more contact, more embodiment, more clarity. They do not just remove pain temporarily. They deepen the person's ability to live. Other states are different. They are spectacular while they last, but afterwards the self falls back into the same uninhabited baseline. And because the contrast is so painful, the person chases the next entry point again. That is how states become objects of pursuit. Once they do, the person may begin confusing state dependency with authenticity. They say that's the real me, when what they often mean is that is one of the few states in which I can temporarily feel fully organized. That distinction is painful, but it is freeing too, because if the state is not the only real self, then ordinary consciousness does not have to remain a wasteland by comparison. It may simply be underdeveloped, undernourished, overstimulated, dissociated, or deprived of the conditions that make presence livable without dramatic amplification. This is the real invitation of this section, to become curious about the emotional economics of the states you love, not cynical, not suspicious in a deadening way, but honest. Honest enough to admit that some of what feels magical may also be medicinal. Some of what feels like truth may also be relief. Some of what feels like purpose may also be anti-numbness. Some of what feels like passion may also be protection from quiet absence. And once that is seen, the self becomes less vulnerable to seduction by intensity alone. You can still love what is beautiful, immersive, erotic, creative, sacred, demanding, or thrilling, but you are no longer naive about why it holds you. You begin to ask not only, does this make me feel alive, but what in me needs this state so badly? And what would life feel like if I did not have to rely on it so completely to feel real? That question is where a deeper freedom begins. When heightened states become identity, one of the biggest risks in chasing powerful states is that, over time, the state stops feeling like an experience and starts feeling like who you are, not in a passing way, not as a mood, not as a preference, as identity. The person no longer says, I sometimes enter this state. They begin saying, this is me, this is when I'm real, this is where I'm most myself. And once that happens, a state that may once have been a doorway becomes a self-story. That is where this part of the episode begins, because many of us do not only chase certain states, we organize our character around them. We start building a narrative in which the intent state is the truest self, and everything quieter becomes compromise, dullness, failure, or loss. The high performer says, I'm at my best under pressure. The romantic says, I only feel alive when I'm in love. The creative says, I only feel like myself when I'm at work. The spiritual seeker says, I'm most real in transcendence. The intense one says, ordinary life is too dead for me. The passionate one says, if it isn't consuming, it isn't real. Again, none of these statements is empty. They point towards something true. But they can also conceal a deeper mechanism. The person has begun mistaking a preferred state of organized consciousness for the whole self. Psychology has known for a long time that selfhood is partly narrative. We do not merely live, we organize what we live into stories about who we are. Once a state is repeated often enough and emotionally reinforced strongly enough, it becomes easy for the mind to build an identity around it. This is one reason Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow was so powerful. He showed that highly absorbing states can feel deeply meaningful because action and awareness become more integrated, self-consciousness decreases, and the person feels more coherent while engaged in the task. But later work has complicated the story. Research by Durkin in 2024 and by Wojciechowski in 2025 suggests that flow is not reducible to a simple challenge-skill balance slogan, and that the state is more variable and context-sensitive than popular culture often implies. In other words, flow is real, but our myths about flow can become simplistic. That matters because once a person has a few powerful experiences of coherence, they may start orienting their whole life around recreating that configuration. The athlete becomes the one who only feels fully alive in training or competition. The entrepreneur becomes the one who needs relentless momentum to feel real. The artist becomes the one who only trusts the self that appears in immersion. The spiritual practitioner becomes the one who quietly devalues ordinary life because only an altered consciousness feels sacred enough. The lover becomes the one who mistakes longing for depth and calm love for decline. This is where neurophysiology helps us understand the seduction. A heightened state often produces a more coherent pattern of attention, action, and reward. The system is less fragmented, noise reduces, salience sharpens. Cognitive control may become more efficient or less effortful in certain contexts. Recent work by Liu and colleagues in 2025 suggests that learning progress and engagement are associated with electrophysiological markers such as reduced distractibility, proactive preparation, and altered parietal alpha dynamics, all of which help explain why deeply engaged states feel so internally organized. When the ordinary self is scattered, conflicted, bored, ashamed, or understimulated, a state like this does not only feel good, it feels redemptive. Once the body learns that redemption, it begins to prefer the state, not just as a pleasure, as a rescue. This is where neurobiology, psychology, and contemplative philosophy start converging, even if they use different vocabularies. A neurobiological account may emphasize salience, attention, reward, autonomic regulation, and state-dependent organization. A psychological account may emphasize reinforcement, identity, compensatory behavior, and self-narrative. A contemplative account may say that the mind becomes attached to specific states because those states temporarily relieve suffering, fragmentation, self-consciousness, or existential dissatisfaction. Different languages, but often the same lived event. And this is where the ego becomes important. Not ego in the cheap insult sense, not arrogance alone, but the organizing self that wants continuity, meaning, identity, recognizability. The ego loves states that make it feel coherent. It loves the state in which it becomes the intense one, the creative one, the awakened one, the visionary one, the high performer, the lover, the athlete, the one who comes alive under pressure. Those identities are not random. They give shape. They reduce ambiguity. They let the person know who they are, at least under certain conditions, and when ordinary consciousness feels fragmented or thin, those identities become even more precious. This is why someone can become dependent not only on a behavior, but on a self-state. Not just addicted to work, but to the version of themselves that appears in work. Not just addicted to romance, but to the self who feels vivid inside longing. Not just addicted to spirituality, but to the self who feels elevated, purified, or more significant in altered states. Not just addicted to competition, but to the self who finally feels cleanly organized under pressure. That is a much deeper attachment than a simple habit. It is an attachment to a preferred identity configuration. Once that happens, ordinary life becomes threatening not because it is objectively bad, but because it fails to produce the same self. This is one reason some people need pressure to perform. Philosophical work by Lang in 2025 argues that flow is not the only state associated with optimal performance, and distinguishes it from clutch states which are often more effortful, more pressured, and more explicitly controlled. That distinction matters because many people confuse high-pressure, high-output states with their best self, when in fact what they may be relying on is a very particular stress-organized version of themselves. The same thing happens in contemplative spaces. Some practitioners become attached not only to insight, but to specific altered modes of consciousness, absorptive calm, bliss, spaciousness, dissolution of ordinary self-boundaries, energetic intensity, unusual clarity, or the sense of being outside ordinary mind. Contemporary work on advanced concentrative absorption meditation, including Yang and colleagues in 2024 and Demir and colleagues in 2025, shows that such states can have distinctive phenomenological and neural correlates. At the same time, broader work by Lieberman and colleagues in 2025 argues that advanced meditation can offer a valuable empirical paradigm for consciousness science. These are serious and fascinating developments, but they also raise a personal question. Does the person return from such states more present in ordinary life, or do they begin quietly devaluing ordinary life in favor of the exceptional state? That is where skeptical voices become essential. Nick Butler and Sverre Spolstra argued in 2024 that flow can become ideological, not only a descriptive concept, but a value system that encourages immersion while weakening critical distance. Their concern is not that flow is unreal, but that it can be glamorized and instrumentalized. That skepticism is useful here. It reminds us that a state can feel excellent and still become socially or psychologically overvalued. A person may become so committed to the ideal of being in flow that they stop questioning what the pursuit of that state is doing to the rest of life. The same skepticism applies to modern mindfulness culture. Divino in 2024 warned that forms of mindfulness can be transformed into technocratic or biopolitical tools, detached from deeper ethical and philosophical roots. Again, the point is not to dismiss contemplative practice, but to notice how easily any state-associated discipline can be absorbed into identity, performance, and control. Even presence can become a role. Even awareness can become brand material for the self. This brings us back to personality. When a state becomes an identity, the person begins defending it. The intense one starts fearing ordinary calm because calm feels like deadness. The spiritual one starts fearing the ordinary body because the ordinary embodiment feels less luminous than transcendence. The performer starts fearing anonymity because without being on, the self feels unstable. The romantic starts fearing settled love because steadiness feels less alive than longing. The creator starts fearing inactivity because without the state of making, the self feels diffuse. At this point, the state is no longer just attractive. It is egosyntonic. It feels like me. And this is where the subject becomes existential. Because if me only appears in specific states, then what is ordinary consciousness? What is the self outside pressure, outside longing, outside ecstatic practice, outside competition, outside creative absorption, outside being needed, admired, desired, or consumed by a project? For many people, that question is quietly terrifying. Not because they lack depth, but because they have not yet learned how to live in contact with themselves outside the preferred state. This is why stillness, ordinary time, relational steadiness, and unstructured life can feel threatening. Not boring in a trivial sense. Threatening. They do not provide the same organizing force. They do not rescue the self from fragmentation so dramatically. They do not produce the same felt identity. And so the person starts telling themselves a story. I'm just not built for ordinary life. I'm too intense. I need more than most people. I'm wired for extremes. Sometimes that may partially reflect temperament, but often it is also a defensive mythology built around state dependence. This does not mean the person is faking their intensity. It means they may be over-identifying with a narrow range of states because those states are where the self feels most coherent. A contemplative lens would say this is attachment. A psychodynamic lens might say it is a defensive idealization of the preferred self-state. A neurophysiological lens might say the person has become conditioned to equate coherence with specific arousal or attentional configurations. A phenomenological lens might say that the world only appears meaningful to them under certain modes of givenness. Again, different descriptions, often the same event. And perhaps that is the most mature way to hold this, not by arguing over which school owns the truth, but by noticing the overlap. The body, the mind, the ego, the narrative self, the contemplative self-observer, all are circling the same question. What happens when a human being begins to rely on certain states to feel real? That is the deeper issue in this part, because once heightened states become identity, they begin shaping not only what you do, but what you will allow yourself to be. They shape your relationships, your work choices, your tolerance for ordinary life, your sense of meaning, your image of depth, your philosophy of selfhood. Unless this is examined, the person can start confusing dependency with authenticity. They say this is my true self when what they may mean is this is the state in which I least feel my fragmentation. That is not a small distinction. It changes the whole project. Instead of trying to live permanently inside the preferred state, the deeper work becomes learning how to widen ordinary consciousness so that the self does not need extreme coherence, conditions just to feel alive. The question shifts from, how do I get back to that state, to what is missing in ordinary life that makes this state feel like the only place I truly exist? That question is harder, less glamorous, less intoxicating, but much more liberating. Because once you begin asking it, the state loses a little of its absolute authority. You may still love it, still seek it in healthy ways, still honor its beauty, but you are no longer entirely captured by the story that it alone is where your real life happens. That is where this part leads. When heightened states become identity, they stop being only experiences and start functioning as self-structures. The body prefers them, the mind narrates them, the ego defends them, and the person begins measuring life against them. Flow, pressure, romance, intensity, transcendence, performance, and absorption all become more than moments. They become identities to inhabit and protect. The danger is not that these states are false. The danger is that they become too important, too flattering, too organizing, too necessary. That is when the question must deepen. Not only what state do I love, but who have I become by loving this state so much? What genuine presence feels like. After all of that, we need a clearer picture of what genuine presence actually feels like. Because if we only talk about the states we chase, then it becomes too easy to assume that real liveliness must always arrive through intensity, immersion, urgency, attraction, or some heightened mode of consciousness. But genuine presence is often much quieter than the states people glamorize. It does not always dazzle. It does not always intoxicate. It does not always make you feel extraordinary. It does not always remove discomfort. And it does not always come with a dramatic sense that something important is happening. Very often, genuine presence feels more like contact than intensity. You are here, in the body, in the room, in the moment, in the conversation, in the work, in the grief, in the simple fact of being alive. There may still be pain, still uncertainty, still tiredness, still complexity, but the person is not absent from it, and they are not being wholly ruled by a more stimulating state either. That is one of the most important distinctions. Presence does not necessarily mean heightened feeling. It means an available feeling, not an amplified self, an accessible self. A person in genuine presence can usually sense what is happening in them without immediately needing to override it, dramatize it, escape it, or turn it into a stronger state in order to feel real. There is a quieter kind of aliveness there, less theatrical perhaps, less addictive, but often more sustaining. This is why genuine presence may initially feel less impressive to people who are used to intensity. It can feel almost too ordinary. A calm conversation in which you are truly listening. A walk where you are actually in the body, and not only in thought. A moment of grief that is fully felt without being turned into a story or shut down. A meal tasted properly. A silence that does not need to be filled. A creative act that does not erase the self but gathers it. A form of intimacy that is steady, not obsessive. A kind of stillness that feels inhabited rather than empty. These moments do not always produce fireworks, but they often produce something better, continuity of contact, and that is what makes them so important. Heightened states can feel extraordinary, but they may leave the person craving more because they were temporarily rescued from absence rather than deeply restored. Genuine presence often does the opposite. It may feel simpler, but it leaves the person more gathered afterwards, not more dependent on repetition. You feel less split, less performative, less compelled, less hungry for the next dramatic state. There is a kind of enoughness in it, not because everything is solved, but because you are not at war with the moment in the same way. This is where embodied presence becomes such a useful phrase. Genuine presence usually includes the body rather than bypassing it. You can feel your feet, your breath, your posture, the atmosphere of the room, the emotional texture of the moment, the truth of your own inner state, and you do not need all of that to become bigger for it to count. It is already real enough. That is why presence is often less addictive than the states we chase. It does not spike and crash in the same way. It does not need a spectacle. It does not always flatter identity. It does not make you feel like the most special version of yourself. But it does something many heightened states do not always do. It leaves you more available to life, not just more stimulated by it. So perhaps the clearest way to say it is this. Genuine presence is often less spectacular than the states we chase, but more livable, more stable, and more real. It does not always feel like the highest high. It feels like contact without distortion, which may be one of the deepest forms of aliveness we ever learn. Integration, learning to feel alive without being ruled by intensity. So where does all of this leave us? If some states genuinely deepen us, and others only make us feel less absent for a while, then the task is not to become suspicious of aliveness. The task is to become more discerning about it. That is the real integration of this episode, because it would be easy to hear all of this and move toward the wrong conclusion. To assume that intensity is dangerous, that flow is suspect, that romance is distortion, that beauty is bait, that immersion is avoidance, that spirituality is compensation, that creativity is just another self-state, that anything vivid must be treated with distance. But that is not the point. The point is not to flatten life in the name of consciousness. The point is to stop confusing every powerful state with truth. There are forms of liveliness that genuinely widen us. Some states gather the self without narrowing it into compulsion. There are moments of flow that are deeply honest. There are experiences of love, beauty, devotion, creativity, intimacy, and absorbed engagement that bring us into more contact, not less. There are forms of immersion that do not help us disappear, but help us arrive. But some states become seductive because they overpower the quieter forms of fragmentation, boredom, numbness, uncertainty, or inner distance that we do not know how to live with directly. If we do not tell the difference, we will build our lives around rescue rather than relationship. That is the line. A person can begin chasing what rescues them from absence and call it purpose. They can begin chasing what silences boredom and call it passion. They can begin chasing what overwhelms inner emptiness and call it truth. They can begin chasing what intensifies them and call it presence. But conscious living asks for something more subtle than that. It asks, what does this state do to me? What does it open? What does it conceal? What does it organize? What does it protect me from? What remains after it has passed? That last question matters enormously, because some states leave a trace of integration behind them. After real presence, after healthy flow, after truthful contact, something in you remains more available, more gathered, more connected. The state is over, but it has not merely taken you away from yourself. It has strengthened your ability to be with yourself afterwards. Other states do the opposite. They dazzle while they are happening, but when they pass, you fall back into the same old flatness, or the same old fragmentation, or the same old restlessness, only now with a greater hunger for the next return. Those are often the states we have to examine most carefully, not because they are evil, not because they are meaningless, but because they may be functioning less as nourishment and more as compensation. That is where self-honesty becomes essential. Not harshness, not suspicion, not self-pathologizing, honesty. The honesty to admit that you may love a state not only because it is beautiful, but because it rescues you from what your ordinary life feels like without it. The honesty to admit that you may be calling something my true self when what you mean is the version of me that feels most coherent under these conditions. The honesty to ask whether your intensity is widening your consciousness or simply overpowering your quiet absence for a while. That is not a cynical way to live. It is a more exact one, because the real danger is not intensity itself. The real danger is dependence on intensity as the only route through which life becomes bearable, meaningful, or real, and that dependence can take many forms. The person who only feels alive under pressure, the person who only feels deep in longing, the person who only feels spiritual in altered states, the person who only feels creative in self-erasure, the person who only feels desirable when being wanted, the person who only feels real in conflict, admiration, risk, performance, or urgency. Each of these states may contain something valuable, but if they become the only door through which the self can feel alive, then ordinary consciousness starts becoming a place of exile rather than habitation. That is what we are trying to undo, not by rejecting the beautiful states, but by rebuilding a relationship with ordinary presence. Because if the ordinary state remains deadened, role-bound, overstimulated, dissociated, or split, then the extraordinary states will always carry too much weight. They will become more than experiences. They will become saviors, and no state can bear that burden indefinitely. That is why genuine presence matters so much. Presence may be quieter than ecstasy, but it is more livable. It may be less intoxicating than obsession, but it is more stable. It may be less glamorous than pressure, but it is more humane. It may be less thrilling than stimulation, but it is often more real. Presence lets you be here without needing to become someone else. It lets you feel alive without needing to be intensified into aliveness. It lets you remain in contact without requiring a dramatic rescue. It lets the ordinary world recover depth. That is a profound shift, because for many people, the ordinary world has lost depth. It has become administrative, procedural, distracted, flattened, and emotionally underpowered. And so of course they chase what makes them feel more. But the deeper work is not simply to find stronger and stronger states. It is to learn how to inhabit life more fully at baseline. That may sound less exciting, but it is more transformative than it first appears. To sit in your own life without immediately needing escape into stimulation. To feel your body without needing amplification. To remain with another person without needing drama for the contact to feel real. To work without only feeling yourself under pressure. To love without needing instability to keep the bond vivid. To pray, create, move, speak, listen, rest, and grieve without needing the state to become spectacular to count. That is a different kind of freedom. Not freedom from intensity, freedom from being ruled by it. Perhaps that is the deepest invitation of this episode, to let the beautiful states remain beautiful, without handing them total authority over what counts as life. To enjoy flow but not worship it. To value passion but not confuse it with truth. To honor deep immersion but not build identity entirely around it. To recognize the seduction of aliveness without becoming naive about why it holds you. To let ordinary presence become meaningful enough that you no longer need extreme states to prove that you exist. This is where discernment becomes a form of care, because once you know the difference between nourishment and rescue, between widened consciousness and overpowering stimulation, between integrated aliveness and state dependence, you can begin relating to your own inner life with much more precision. You can ask, what actually leaves me more whole? What leaves me merely more charged? What helps me come back to myself? What only helps me escape the self I cannot yet bear? What kind of aliveness can I actually live inside, rather than only visit? These are not minor questions. They shape love, work, creativity, spirituality, rest, identity, purpose, attention, what you trust, what you repeat. What do you call life? And perhaps that is the final sentence of this integration. Conscious living is not about rejecting intense or beautiful states. It is about learning how to feel alive without handing your whole authority to intensity. That is where the work becomes real. So this episode has really been about a distinction that many people sense, but do not often name clearly enough. The difference between feeling more alive and being more conscious. We began by recognizing that not every living state is presence. Some states feel magnetic, vivid, immersive, and deeply compelling, not because they bring us into fuller contact, but because they overpower the quieter forms of absence underneath them. From there we explored what flow actually is, not mere stimulation, not obsession, not compulsion, but organized immersion, a state in which action and awareness become more coherent. We then distinguished presence from stimulation, and looked at how modern life trains us to trust intensity more than contact. From there, we moved into the states we chase: work, romance, adrenaline, spirituality, performance, creative highs, recognition, urgency, and even conflict. We explored how heightened states can become compensations for numbness, fragmentation, boredom, or flatness, and how people begin to build identity around the self that appears only under certain powerful conditions. We looked at the role of the body, the nervous system, ego, narrative selfhood, contemplative attachment, and the psychological need for coherence. And through all of it, one central insight emerged. Not every state that makes us feel more is making us more present. Some states widen us, some organize us, some deepen us, some bring us back. Others only rescue us temporarily from what ordinary life feels like without them. That is not a small distinction, because once it is missed, a person can build an entire life around the chase, around the next state that makes them feel coherent enough, vivid enough, loved enough, wanted enough, inspired enough, spiritual enough, or pressured enough to escape the quieter truths they do not yet know how to inhabit. But once that distinction is seen, something changes. Intensity loses a little of its glamour, ordinary presence gains some dignity, and the question is no longer only, what makes me feel alive? It becomes, what kind of liveliness actually leaves me more whole? That is the deeper question of episode 8, not whether beauty matters, not whether passion matters, not whether flow is real, but whether the state is widening consciousness or simply overpowering the absences we have not yet learned to meet directly. And perhaps that is the real conclusion. Genuine presence is often less spectacular than the states we chase, but more sustaining, more integrated, and more real. It may not dazzle in the same way, but it does something better. It leaves you more available to your own life. In the next episode, we move from the states we chase into one of the deepest mechanisms shaping all of them. Attention is reality. Whether we are in flow, stimulation, numbness, obsession, pressure, longing, overload, or quiet presence, one thing is always deciding the shape of the world we inhabit, where awareness goes. In episode 9, we'll explore why where your attention goes becomes the world you live in. We'll look at attention as more than focus in the narrow sense, as a structuring force that determines what becomes vivid, what disappears, what feels important, what becomes your reality, and what remains outside the field. We'll explore how attention is captured, trained, fragmented, directed, stolen, reinforced, and conditioned. We'll ask why attention is one of the most powerful currencies of consciousness, why so much of modern life is organized around taking hold of it, and why losing sovereignty over attention may be one of the deepest ways a self becomes quietly colonized. Because once you understand the states you chase, the next question becomes unavoidable. What gives those states their shape? What makes one thing dominate consciousness while another falls away? What decides what becomes your world in the first place? From liveliness and being alive to selection, from state to spotlight, from what consciousness feels like to what consciousness lands on, and that may be one of the most important moves in the whole series. So as we come to the end of this episode, I want to leave you with this: stay close to the difference between presence and intensity. Notice the states that truly widen you. Notice the ones that merely overpower what hurts. Notice what leaves you more grounded afterwards, and what leaves you hungry for another dose of aliveness, because ordinary life still feels too thin without it. Let yourself love what is beautiful, immersive, charged, and alive, but do not hand it your whole authority too quickly. Ask what it gives you. Ask what it protects you from. Ask whether it is helping you come back to yourself, or simply helping you escape the self you do not yet know how to inhabit. Because that difference matters. It shapes what you call love, what you call purpose, what you call spirituality, what you call passion, what you call creativity, and even what you call being alive. Thanks for joining me today. Until next time, you've been listening to the Consciousness Code Podcast, Episode 8 Flow Presence and the States We Chase. I'm James Miller.